RDAR's big idea. Canada is not short of agriculture, innovation, we're short of adoption and scaling. If we want adoption, the system has to start with producers, de-risk change, and deliver clear value, not just ideas.
The most important part of any game is being there. Enjoy more flexibility with your time thanks to the wider application window and enhanced performance of SphereX fungicide, made to show up when it counts. agsolutions.ca.
You're listening to the Ag Policy Connection, brought to you by Real Agriculture in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We're connecting the dots between the people and the policies that shape agriculture and farming today and into the future.
Welcome to the Ag Policy Connection, a podcast where we talk about the big ideas and fresh thinking needed to solve the big challenges and seize the big opportunities facing Canadian agriculture and food. I'm one of your hosts, Tyler McCann, the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I've been working in ag policy and politics for 20 years, and I'm a policy wonk.
And I'm not, but I'm your other host, Elise Bigley, the Director of Strategic Projects at CAPI, Canada's agriculture and food think tank. In this podcast, we'll be talking to leaders across agriculture and food about their big ideas to create generational change in ag policy.
That's right, Elise. We think the time has come for ag policy to catch up with the changes happening on farms and processing facilities and across the system that produces food and more and gets it to customers in Canada and around the world. We are excited to work with Real Agriculture to bring some of the big ideas for change to you. Make sure to visit CAPI's website, subscribe to our mailing list, follow us on our socials and on YouTube to keep up to date.
And with that, let's get started. Today's episode will look a little different as we'll be interviewing two guests in a crossover episode with the Final Mile podcast, a real agriculture podcast series brought to you by RDAR, Results-Driven Agriculture Research, which highlights how investment in research is critical to delivering real on-farm impact. Joining us today is Dr. Mark Redmond, CEO of RDAR, who will be sharing his big idea. We also have the Final Mile's host with us, Shaun Haney, who will be adding his perspective and what he's been hearing from producers and across the industry. With a PhD in infectious diseases, Mark Redmond has experience as a scientific researcher, inventor, and innovator, education leader, and entrepreneur. Before his role at RDAR, Mark served as the director of the Emergence Incubator at PEI BioAlliance, associate dean of the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology's School of Health and Life Sciences, and Executive Director of the Institute for Reconstructive Sciences in Medicine. And our other guest needs no introduction on this platform, except that we're pleased to put Shaun Haney in the hot seat today, answering instead of asking the tough questions. So Shaun and Mark, welcome to the Ag Policy Connection.
Thank you. Good day.
Yeah, great to be here. Absolutely.
Great. So to put this into context, Shaun, you've been hearing a lot through the Final Mile podcast about where research and innovation are falling short in practice, where they're not quite making it to that final mile to the farm. And Mark, that's exactly the challenge RDAR is focused on. So we're going to jump right in and ask Mark, what's your big idea that kind of connects all of this?
So the big idea topical today is that Canada is not short of agricultural innovation. We are short of adoption and scaling. And it's great that we have Shaun on the call, and we've been talking Final Mile. For many years, research has fallen short of the farm. The researchers are great at making presentations, publishing papers. I always put the analogy there in terms of that news ends up in the mailbox at the end of the farmer's driveway. We actually want to see results put into the hands of producers so they can be put into practice. Because public investment in agriculture only delivers value if producers are able to adopt it. And so that adoption challenge is really what we have been set up to do. And it's actually in RDAR's vision statement that for agriculture to achieve its full potential, our statement says in Alberta, but I will challenge Canada to this as well, that full potential is only met when you accelerate and adopt those results of the research.
Thanks, Mark. And I want to dive deeper into that. But before we get into that, we want to hear more about the journey that led you to this idea. So, Mark, can you tell us a bit about your career and experience as a researcher and innovator, and basically what brought you to today?
Well, I could probably take the whole hour talking about that, so I won't. We'll focus in on really where I came to RDAR. RDAR was set up in 2020, really with the objective of being producer-led. the government of Alberta asked producers, about 2,000 of them, what do you want? And their number one response was to have producers lead the research. And so that idea in terms of relevancy to the work that they need to see have done has to be job one. Historically, organizations, universities, researchers have come forwards with their big idea and saying, I want to develop this, and it hasn't had the application on the farm. So by having the producers right at the table at the start of the discussions, that brings relevancy and focus. If you're there at that front stage, chances are the innovation that's developed will actually have application for you on the farm. So my career actually has been all about that. I was fortunate in my early career days to work in the Veterinary Infectious Disease Organization, VIDO as it was in the day, going right from early genetics. We did develop the world's first genetically engineered vaccine for livestock, work that through production, putting it into the hands of producers and looking at its effect. And so that really set my career on its path in terms of that ideas to innovation. And that's where I have been. I was actually on PEI in 2020 when RDAR was set up. And actually, I got the invitation to come back to Alberta to lead this innovative group. And we have gone through a number of iterations of our strategic plan, but always as our North Star has been that delivering the results into the hands of producers.
And Shaun, you've been in the ag media space for a while now. I'm curious as to kind of why has innovation played such a role for kind of you and the work that Real Agriculture has done?
Well, there's tons of innovation in the communication space. No, in like every sort of different piece of our industry of agriculture. You know, if I think in terms of not only how we communicate information or insight to farmers and ranchers across the country today versus, you know, even 5 or for sure 15 years ago when we first started, how farmers receive and use that information has also evolved and changed, and trying to stay on top of that is really incredibly difficult and a great challenge, I think, for everybody. There's a lot of noise out there, right? There's more and more information for people to choose from, and so it's a challenge for both content creators, but also the consumers of that information, farmers and ranchers. I think, you know, at this time when you do have that level of noise, having solid not only research, but also the communication of that research is so critical. Because you can have great research, but if it gets spun in a way that is counter to what the research actually did, it's going to fall, it's going to really fall flat and not have the level of efficacy that, you know, I think the researcher or the funder would have wanted. So I think it's more so critical than ever that we not only are talking about funding of research and the execution of that research, but also how we communicate that research is absolutely important, whether that's conferences to podcasts like this or all the other options in between.
But Shaun, how early in the Real Ag journey did you get into the Pulse School and the Canola School as kind of a big part of the product offering that you're doing?
Oh, early. So yeah, and again, some of the best ideas come out of, you know, having a 6-pack of beer with a buddy in the office in an afternoon. And we were sort of like the Canola School was actually the first school that we did, which was just another form of extension, right? Instead of going to a field day or a conference and hearing somebody in extension talk about, you know, best practices, why not take it to YouTube? And in like 2010, those are the early days of YouTube. And myself and a friend that worked at the Canola Council at the time, who's now farming, we're like, let's go shoot a video on plant stands. Let's go in the, and so we went out to the backyard of our farm and we started shooting videos, and the crop schools were born. And all of these, I think 2010 was the first episodes, and all of a sudden, before I knew it, we were in Ontario doing a wheat or a corn school and a soybean school. It really took off because people saw that it was like on-demand programming, getting that information from the researcher to the extension to the farmer as fluidly, less friction as possible.
So thanks for that, Shaun. Mark, I'm wondering how many of RDAR's ideas have come from a 6-pack?
I actually can't answer that question. I'm going to put that on our funding application forms to define that. I would say many ideas for our funding calls actually have come from being out in the field and actually talking to the producers. And again, that's one differential that RDAR is able to use. I mean, when we sit around the board table, we've got 11 producers in the discussion. However, when we get out and meet with producers and researchers at our events, Shaun actually hosted our last research showcase here in Edmonton. We get 300 or 400 people at a gathering through distributing the off-calf program. We've actually met with over 3,000 farmers. And those are all discussion or opportunities for discussion. And so whether it happens over a six-pack, more likely to be a coffee, that connection is really essential in terms of what is it that you need. And one of the drivers to adoption that we struck on through those conversations, through webcasts, it's great in terms of here's the information, but having that two-way discussion and did this resonate? What struck you as being important? What will make you adopt a change? We came up with three overarching requirements from the producers. And we have to remember that producers are business people first. They're the guys taking the risk. And so if we think about what's limiting uptake of innovations, it does come to risk and the need to lower risk. The producers ask three questions. First one is, how much is it going to cost me to do this? And actually, I'm told the producer also has to be able to reply to their spouse in terms of, yes, dear, I'm going to have to invest this much money in this innovation. Leads into the second question, though, in terms of what's the ROI going to be? And how long is it going to take me to recoup that cost? And without that information being provided by the researchers, things aren't going to move forwards. The third question is, who can help me with this? Now, if it's a neighbor who's had some success and you're looking over the fence in terms of how do you do that, that's great. In Alberta, we also have the Applied Research and Forage Associations, so regional groups who can help you see how innovations have been applied at a field scale. And that's really important. And if we want to talk about AFSC closures as well, that field scale experimentation that's been undertaken, that's the differentiator. That's what we need. And if you can't give a producer those three answers clearly and financially, they won't take that risk. And so standing out in the field, talking about an innovation, if you can deliver those types of metrics, now you get them excited.
To that point, I think this is one of the differences in there's differences in the challenge here of, if you're talking about an innovation and measuring those returns inside of a dairy barn or a poultry operation, you've removed, some of the elements and variability of the weather or the conditions. It's more constant. In cropping agriculture, the ROI is still very important, but it's a heightened challenge to try to prove through and provide the producer with some of those answers. And I think that's why those field-sized scalability tests and field proofing it, so to speak, is over a number of different seasons. Remember, we only get one season, which is another whole challenge here. We only plant and we only harvest once a year, and it's not Brazil, so that becomes a challenge in this too.
And you're absolutely right, Shaun. That one chance that really does have to value add up into that assessment in terms of whether you're going to take that risk. And I think you'll remember back in January when you were hosting our event, you actually had an interview with Terry Sidoric, the CEO of Seller Insights. And Seller Insights has an innovation for measuring the health of potatoes and the storage of potatoes in their bins. And you asked him, what's holding people back? And one of the number one, what's holding you back is the whole behavior and needing to change behavior and willing to take that risk. So if you mess up, that could be your business on the line.
But how much of the issue and how much of what RDAR is trying to do though is more about not kind of just answering those questions, but about getting researchers to think about those questions kind of when they're doing their research and coming up with the research ideas, right? Because I think that the idea that producers want that information, that's not that big of an idea, right? I think it's the model of how do we build that into the entire research system and not just ask the questions once the research that's done that gets to be different.
And you are asking for a paradigm shift there, Tyler. And it has been a challenge. 3 or 4 years ago, when we started pushing hard on this on our applications, the scientists were saying, we don't know how to do this. But actually, this is where getting what I call the T4P team, the transdisciplinary, so you need to bring all these different skills, science, accounting, farming around the table, and having the producers, the private and the public sector researchers working together. We're not asking the researchers to do this alone. We're asking them for working in partnership. And part of the strength of the Living Labs was that partnership in terms of getting the scientists into the field and talking to the farmers. Because they'll tell you how to measure these parameters and what they need to know. Yes, if I think back in my career when I was a lab scientist, I had no idea calculating what the cost of a vaccine was and whether that vaccine would be taken up. So talking to the actual people in the field who are going to be buying your product, so the customer is really important. That drives those decisions. And to be honest, Tyler, even today, we don't see that level of information being presented. And so that whole agri economics is really surfacing now as an absolute skill that's required. We talk a lot to ag economists. We're actually learning how to do these calculations ourselves because we know that that is what will drive the innovation change that we need.
Yeah. Like there's like two things. Farmers have to have clear communication on what they need, to achieve ROI, margin opportunity, reducing risk, cost control, all those kinds of things. And we can't have, because of the lack of the dollars that are out there, we have to be efficient with how we spend the research dollars. Mark knows that better than anybody. So we can't have researchers off doing pet projects where it's like, I find this really interesting. There's no use for this information, but I'm like, as a researcher, I think it's really cool. We can't have that. And so I think one of the challenges the industry has is trying to bring that wide band of what farmers need or what would be valuable and trying to bring that into a succinct list, right? One of our greatest strengths is the diversity of the industry. We have all shapes and sizes, Atlantic Canada all the way to BC and everywhere in between. There's a lot of different kinds of farms. And they all have different kinds of requirements and asks. It's not like the airline industry. If you went to Air Canada and WestJet and Porter, they're going to give you a pretty similar list in terms of some of the research they think needs to be done inside the country. Agriculture is not that. And so that's where, one of the things that we did was starting Real Agri Studies was try to, instead of the farmer's opinion or thoughts being kind of hijacked and everybody making assumptions based on, I talked to 3 farmers, trying to bring that together from a wider band and trying to be able to summarize 70% believe this, 30% that, and getting a true understanding of what are some of those opinions and sentiments the farmers have around topics like research and some of the outcomes that are possible.
So Tyler, one requirement we're going to be implementing, I'll let the cat out of the bag, on our application forms on the front, it's going to be, I have spoken to a farmer or rancher about this idea.
Nice.
And okay, interesting. I wonder, do you think Shaun, when you're saying it's a problem with the industry, like the diversity is our strength, but then it also causes these issues, do we overcomplicate it in a way? Like, is it about more so getting researchers thinking about these things earlier on and seeing research as partnership and not this is a cool project? And Mark, I really liked the way that you phrased it and the work that RDAR is doing in terms of from the hands of producers into the hands of producers. It kind of shows that full cycle. Wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Well, I think it can be complex if you are very siloed. But if you create environments and ecosystems for those different stakeholders to interact, then probably has less chance to be complex, it's a case of there's just lots of stuff that happens in this industry that I see where do we have farmer representation? Oh, yes, we've got, 3 farmers on committee. Well, are those the right farmers? Like, are those farmers connected? Like, what are they connected to? Like, what is like some of the background? So I think the more we have, we encourage and foster less siloing and more connectivity between researchers and farmers and everywhere in between, probably the better off we are.
But I would have thought that, that's not that big of an idea. But it seems like if you look at what the federal government's done, where they pulled back on living labs, Mark, you talked about how that was a good example. Like, I guess, is this a sign that this actually is a bigger idea and we haven't really kind of fully grasped the challenge that we've got, bridging that gap between researchers and farmers?
I think it is the big idea, and it's not easy. And that's I think the idea is easy to say, to actually make it happen, and willing to find producers and scientists willing to give up their time to work together. It's a different mix. And traditionally, academics, they have been siloed. They have their labs or their teams. And I think the opportunity today, given the closures, given the changes in funding, that bigger team approach, if you want to say Team Canada, I think that's a strong approach. You are still going to see regionalization, though, and that's one thing that the living labs have given us. And even within Alberta, the 12 applied research and forage associations that we have, they're regional, because that a big province, one size is not going to fit all in terms of practice. And that's even when it comes to policy. I think when we look at policies across Canada, we want one size fits all. And people say, well, off-calf, I'll prod the bear here. It's worked very well in Alberta. Hasn't worked so well in other places. The return on the government's investment hasn't been that great. I think that's a sign of a healthy environment in terms of one size doesn't fit all. And we have to have that flexibility in our tactics in terms of what is going to work.
But so Mark, you brought up off-calf. I think it's an interesting contrast, right? Because part of your big idea is we need to de-risk adoption through better engagement between researchers and producers. I think often when we think about de-risking these days, we think about financial incentives and we think about off-calf and let's just pay producers and we'll deal with that. What's the cost of this or what's the ROI with this with government financial incentives? How do you think about kind of those two sides of that de-risking coin around kind of extension and engagement versus financial incentives?
The role of the financial incentive is important because we have spoken about the first point of my 3 questions. How much is it going to cost me to get into this? And until you do prove out the value of a practice, lowering the barrier for adoption is important. The second test, though, is when you're thinking about these programs, what's the resilience of that program? Is that program going to continue to be, or is the learning, the beneficial management practice, is it going to continue to be used? And over the 3 years that we've been using or distributing that program across Alberta, we are seeing resiliency in certain practices. And we're seeing those return on investments being calculated. And so, for example, rotational grazing, big upfront investment, $25,000, $30,000 for a farm. Buying new watering systems. Where is that ROI? We are now seeing, though, producers who've adopted those changes, seeing faster pasture recovery, greater moisture retention in the soils, faster regrowth of the forests, of the forage crops, but also the animals eating that forage are growing faster. And so they're reaching their market weights faster. So you can say, well, that was a big ticket item to purchase, and it took some while to invest. But now actually we're getting the data that we actually can go on broadcasts like this and talk about it. Here's the ROI, and that can actually encourage that scaling and spread of the adoption. If the practice is going to stop as soon as the money stops, that wasn't a good investment. And so having that complexity in terms of the decision making, in terms of where you are going to make those subsidies available, that's key. And as we look at CAPI and some of the discussions we're looking at now, going forwards into the Halifax meetings. Those factors are going to be really important in terms of where we're going to invest in the future and where we'll invest in research in the future.
So, Mark, you brought up resilience of adoption. So, Shaun, I know you have thoughts on adoption, and whether it's the right metric we should focus on. And I think that segues really nicely into that. Do you think kind of adoption is the right metric that we should be focusing on, or should we look broadly or more broadly, or?
So I think adoption is important, but I think we need to also look at the longevity of that adoption. So in some circles, they talk about disadoption. And when, there was a study that Iowa State University did where they looked at, their researchers found that 20% of farmers who adopt new conservation or tech practices may disadopt within 1 year. Well, that's not efficient use of taxpayer dollars either, right? So if we deem this practice to be important and it connects to a broader strategic plan, incentivize producers to adopt, and then they're disadopting within a year, something's amiss. And so I think we also need to make sure that we're having some sort of KPI tied to the longevity of that adoption and then measuring back, okay, did it actually provide a return on investment like we had promised or we had talked about? Or was this just something in a slideshow that the government talked about? Hey, did you know 65% of producers are now doing this instead of that? And this is a feel-good story. I think we need to get a little bit more into the meat of it a little bit more often than we are.
And Mark, Mark, if I can.
I was just going to say to Shaun, if you're not going to stick with something for a year, I don't think you've adopted it. I think you tried it.
Right. That's very fair, but in some of the programs, what happens is I think the producer's like, oh, if I do this, I get this, I get it. I'll be hyperbolic. I get it for free. Well, why wouldn't I do it? Right. And so there's not a connection to like, it's really doomed from the beginning, right? Depending on how that is structured.
Yeah, and that's where, within the off-calf program that we administer, I keep picking on that one because we've got some recent data there. The fact that you actually have to have a plan going forwards, you have to engage the PAG in terms of looking at your proposal. There's a fair bit of work that's required. This isn't just a case of putting in an application and receiving funding. The extra element that we're about to put into play as well is we're going to survey people who've received the funding. So we've done 3,500 projects. It's a large number of projects. What is the resiliency? What have the outcomes that you've achieved? I think a lot of programs that we're seeing, if you're just simply asking the question, have you adopted it? That's falling short, and that's not going to get us the success and the experience we need to keep creating better projects, programs to run forwards with. There has to be that continued, I'll use my medical expression, post-mortem of the events. And so since we are seeing the sundowning on things like living labs, we'll see sundowning on off-calf in 2 years. We need to be able to conduct those studies so we know what to do in the future.
But Mark, I mean, you talked about kind of the need to have the financial incentives in place while we prove out the practice. It seems like, in my mind, based on kind of what I see from programs today, we don't have a good connection to, hey, this practice has been proved out. Let's pull back the financial incentive and put it some other place where it's needed. And again, this is where I think the focus on bridging that research to innovation to adoption gap gets to be so different because it puts more pressure on, okay, like once we've proven that this works, this is a different context and we need to think differently about the financial incentive piece. And we should be leaning on, we've got the evidence, we've got the demonstration sites. Ideally, we would have had the living labs or something like that where you can go see this work in practice. And I think that's the disconnect, Mark, that I think I hear you talking about, but I'm not sure I see fully reflected in Canadian ag policy and programs today.
I think you're right. It's not reflected largely. And if you want to say that RDAR, for the most part, is one of these experiments. It was the first time that we had a producer-led research funding group put together in Canada. What's working, what isn't. Again, the difference in our practices, we do look at being agile. So we get to decisions quickly so that within the time period that we're operating, we actually can demonstrate some of those results. I'm always keen on measuring, reporting, and validating. So it's a very different lens to research. I'd say that is really atypical. You could say, well, it's big corporate. Well, why wouldn't we adopt some of these best practices from big corporate and push them down through our systems here?
Mm.
I want to bring us back to kind of Canada's innovation system as a whole, and I know we've talked a lot about that, but just where exactly the breakdown happens between research and on-farm implementation, and is that breakdown right at the beginning? If research isn't informed by producers, is it broken from the start, or where else do we see that breakdown?
If it's not informed, then you're off to a bad start. So how is that informing happening? It's happening by talking to the farmers and ranchers, talking to veterinarians, and where are the problems? The other policy piece I have to say I spent a fair bit of time thinking about is the whole price takers situation in terms of vaccines being a great example. You want me to spend a dollar vaccinating my animal, and the benefit is going to accrue to the packer. How am I going to capture some of that value on the farm? I can look at Shaun and say, we have had a lot of emphasis on increasing yields. So what do farmers want to see? Oh, we want to see more bushels per acre. Perhaps what we should be looking at is more of the resiliency, getting higher quality product, getting paid for that product. So again, we're now standing the commodity market on its head and asking for people to be paid differently for the crops that they're producing. I think that approach is going to come in the future. And part of our challenge, again, is to be doing that horizon scanning. And as groups of researchers, it could be 15 or 20 years before we realize those investments. So having those milestones and tracking things in that direction is also important. And also milestones is a tool that RDAR uses extensively. In the past, researchers, and they complain a lot about this, they're saying, well, you're only funding projects. It might be a 5-year project. Well, I want a program. Well, and the example that's always put forward is canola. If we were to try and develop canola today, it wouldn't happen. People forget that canola took 30 years to develop and still continues to develop. And it was done in this sectional manner. And so we got to challenge some of the thinking that comes at us, particularly from the academics, in terms of where we are going to drive forwards initiatives. It has to be based on the right premise, and there will be check-ins along the way.
And I have to wonder, Mark and Shaun, I'll get you to react to this. That if you look at what we've seen with the federal government, again, Living Labs has gone away. We've seen the closures of research sites. We've seen this breakdown. We see these pressures in academia. I wonder how much of the lack of that disconnect, one is probably producing research results that aren't what we want, but also is creating the space where farmers don't have as good of an understanding as they should about what's happening in these research sites, what's playing out, and whether or not there's kind of these secondary impacts of not having that connection earlier on in research cycle. Do you think that plays into that?
No, the connection is really important. And it's something we can borrow from the U.S. land grant universities. They talk in terms of taking the university to the farm. Doesn't happen today. I think part of the experience, and again, when you talk to profs from the land grants, they'll say when you do take the university to the farm actually comes to the university.
Mm-hmm.
And that dialogue is really important. And I see a very strong disconnection today.
When I had led the facilitation of the innovation roundtables with the government and FCC and CFA and bioenterprise, earlier we were talking about how the lack of connection between the researcher, the innovator, and the farmer, that was something that just blew me away, how that came up in every province. There was one province that didn't come up. It wasn't a challenge. It was identified as a major challenge in every single province. And remember, a lot of times we think of because, especially when I think about Saskatchewan, there is some great pieces of innovation that have been fostered out of that province because they were solving a problem. There was a farmer solving a problem. And so that's how I think a lot of times we think about some of these things. But not every innovator grew up on a farm. They may have been in the oil field and they think they have some sort of technology and a piece they need some research done that where it applies to agriculture. They don't know anyone. So like I actually think Mark's checkbox of have you talked to a farmer rancher about this is actually really excellent from that standpoint. When we one of the other things you hear a lot about the Canadian market is scalability, and in the commercialization process of innovation, where we've done the research, we've proven out the technology, but trying to get it from company A to being that company Z at the other end of the trail, whatever that is. There's a whole bunch of mush in the middle that is really difficult for Canadian innovators and researchers trying to overcome some of those hurdles. That's another thing that came up a lot.
I think that's the value of death there in finance.
Yes.
And I can say, because we do look, I mean, the other value driver, a good friend, Ted Billier, has often said, the best form of a BRM is that having a manufacturing plant in your neighborhood. So when we look at, I've got a number of fractionation facilities here, so we're not shipping our pulses and grains overseas. We'll ship value-added products. They reach a value of death going from pilot plant, so maybe a $5 million investment. The next step, they're stymied. And that is a gap that does have to be addressed on the finance side of things. FCC Capital have made some inroads. Justine Hendricks has been very brave in terms of saying, I want to see risk taken. As I look at it, a number of these institutions are still banks. And, we need to find a way. It's all about risk reduction in terms of adopting a practice on the farm, or risk reduction in terms of what's it going to take to go that next investment step. And that is going to be critical. So if we're looking at the policy frameworks, which are going to be required, that is one I think that deserves a long, hard look, because we do have a number of these opportunities which are foundering on the rocks of progress because they can't get that investment. Potential way of doing things, and we've toyed around this with the ideas actually for the farmers to invest in these facilities themselves. They will benefit, and if they can actually be cost makers, that I think is a good opportunity in the future. We are opening a lot of new avenues for exploration, but I think that's part of our job is to challenge the process with a number of these ideas.
So, Mark, you've touched on this already, but thinking more about the future, what does that mean aside of what you've already said? We need to change. What needs to happen?
Well, the easy answer is we need to talk more about these things and talk more in the right.
But it seems like that's not the easy thing to do. Yeah.
Well, I think we're making a great start today, and actually, Shaun's podcasts, putting out these discussions and actually starting those dialogues. It's really important, and actually working together. I will say we've helped a number of groups working with Justine and FCCV or FCC Capital. Those started with easy conversations actually in Ottawa. So how do we grow those and actually call each other into account? And why aren't we seeing those investments? With FCC, they have multi-billions of dollars they're bringing in. They're looking at big plays. Well, how about a few home runs or a few base hits as well as the home runs?
But Mark, I get that. In the meantime, what I've seen when I look at the federal policy context and the provincial policy context is reductions in innovation spending, kind of no clear indication that innovation is a priority, lack of action on regulatory reform. So I worry that people like you and Justine talk about innovation, talk about how important it is. FCC talks to all of their value, their investment funds and kind of their partners in that $7 billion coalition that's there. And in the meantime, we're closing federal research sites. We're under investing in innovation. we've got all of these gaps that exist, and we don't have that connection between the research branch and producers across the country. Like it seems like as much as we think about this great potential for the future, there are these big barriers standing in the way of actually delivering on this change.
So some of the challenges, we have to stand up and be counted, Tyler. Actually, we're doing that more. I know when you in your October meeting last year, when we had Deputy Hanson, we have those very public challenges and talk about where things need to go. If we do stay in our silos and we stay close to home, we're not going to get that level of change that we need to see. It's not. You, yeah. It's like when you're trying to close a deal or you're trying to find funding. You're probably going to have to kick down 20 doors and have 20 conversations in order to have the one which is going to generate the level of change that you want. So we need to be resilient in our own discussions.
And Shaun, what change do you need to see? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add to that. I think I'm going to get to your question there is like, and maybe I'm going to answer the question with a question is, do we really have a clear enough picture or have we revised enough what our actual KPI is we're trying to achieve? Like is at the end of the day is number of farmers that are farming. Is that the KPI? Is it overall farm profitability? Is it, what percent of farms are, digitized? Is it, is it a certain practice? Like that's the part that feels a little bit unclear to me in terms of like, okay, at the end of the day, considering all of this, what do we actually want to be the outcome? Because I bet you if I went to a lot of different stakeholders, you're going to get, and maybe it's okay we get a lot of different answers. I don't know. I throw that out. I throw that back at the group.
But Shaun, is the issue not the outcome actually doesn't matter?
Okay.
Right, because what Mark's premise is what we need to do is connect farmers and researchers better together at the beginning. And one of the reasons why I think that idea should get more attention is that it is like, regardless of the outcome that you're looking for, it seems like we should be doing that anyways.
Makes sense.
So how come we're not?
Past practices. There's probably, just things that are pumping into my head. This is research. This is, I'm not sure the farmer would have much input in what, needs to be done. Like there's probably some attitudes like that. There is the reverse. Farmers probably aren't as interested as they should be in some of these things earlier on. Now, some very much are, but maybe the masses aren't enough if you want to judge it that way. It's artificial barriers that need to be busted up, broken down, and we need to break some stuff.
I actually, we took RDAR on the road to Medicine Hat a couple of years ago, and we're presenting a lot of the research we're doing. And we actually have a program within RDAR we call the Producer Researcher and Evaluation Project. We actually want the farmers to be researchers. So you come up with your own research project, and we'll give you a modest amount of money to try your idea, and we'll actually tie you together with some technical people. And I asked the question of the room, why are you doing this more? And the answer that came back is the farmers don't see themselves as doing research. And I said, you got to be kidding. You do research every year. What crop am I going to grow? How much fertilizer am I going to put on it? You don't recognize it. But it came back, we're afraid of doing research. Their words, we are afraid. And fear to me is a major, it's a major worry and a detractor. So how do we get that confidence in the community so that they can understand that they can actually be part of the research community? And we mentioned that with Living Labs, getting the scientists out there in their boots, in the field, talking to producers. Broke one challenge, and it is behavior, Shaun. It's that Terry Sidoric question that you asked. So you're spot on that request. if you can break the academics' behavior, if you can get the confidence in the farmer, now you've got a different system to work with, and you can't underestimate the importance of that confidence.
But in some of those cases, Mark, when we're doing on-farm, I've done lots of interviews and videos over my career about, the need to do on-farm research. And I've always wondered about how the use of research, is that kind of an overshoot? Is that being a little bit hyperbolic? Like, are we not talking on-farm testing? Not necessarily is that really research? We don't have replication. We're not maybe following what probably most researchers would call a proper, methodology of that. Are we selling that a little bit hard in terms of some of that being research?
Well, we're not doing nuclear science here, so I'm not quite sure we need that degree of scrutiny. I do see, a number of the practices they've gone through that. I mean, you can talk about crop development. We've done the RVTs. Okay, we've got all that data. We know how it works. The farmers want to know how it's going to work on a field scale. And so that multiplication is important. Actually, I do believe I should have Tyler look into this while he's over in Europe. The French applied research groups, every year they'll have a national study. They'll take a protocol, which is agreed upon. And to your point, Shaun, protocols are really important, and you can't deviate from them too much if you're going to collect useful information, which you can compare. But in France, they have a protocol, and they'll deploy it across the country, across the whole hexagon. And they'll collect that data. And that's how they will make an assessment in terms of a national program. I'd love to see that happen in Alberta. I mean, Canada's maybe a little bit big to try that. So we are looking at some of those opportunities. So how can you're not going to get a single farmer necessarily running replicates, although today with sectional control on drills and some of the work that's being done with Alberta Grains in terms of plot to farm, in a single 160 acres, quarter section, you actually could be running multiple controls or experiments that your combine's going to tell you your differences. The tools are there today. RDAR funds plot to farm with Alberta Grains. Do we talk up enough of those results? I think we do 14 or 16 plot to farms on a yearly basis. Well, 55,000 farms in Alberta, it's a very small change. But those small changes are beginning to make differences. Certainly, what I would see a further need to be, though, is how can we scale some of those resources like plot to farm that we can actually do 160 farms a year as opposed to 16. RDAR is fortunate in terms of we can use our funding not only for seed variety development, bovine genetics, we actually can use our funding for proving out some of these changes. And again, an advantage that RDAR is really fortunate to have is the flexibility in terms of looking where we're going to make our investments. Other programs don't have that degree of flexibility.
I'm going to flip one of the questions that Shaun, you asked about just on its head a little bit. So you're saying, what's the KPI? Like, what's our end goal of, like, do people not know, or do we not know what our goal is and what needs to be changed? And I'm wondering if we're just not aware of what the risk is if we don't change. And like, are things not broken enough? Do they have to be even more broken for us to change? And I know, Mark, you mentioned fear is not best driver for things, but I think in sometimes these cases we do need a bit of fear in to kind of push us. So if we don't know what is the risk of if status quo and how we go, will we actually change?
At least you want a crisis to generate that degree of change.
So I don't want a crisis, but it seems to be the thing that moves people to action.
I feel like there's a lot of crisis already. Do you want to add more to this, Elise? What are you talking about?
I think you're putting words in my mouth. I don't want to add this, but
there's a huge opportunity cost here. Okay, and when we look at just productivity and competitiveness, I think the opportunity cost is massive and it's huge. And Canada has had a fairly good time of it when it comes to some of the commodities that we are producing across this country. And there are different jurisdictions that are catching up. They are they are getting more technology on farm, and they're skipping steps, right? They're going from no phones to Starlink internet. Like they're not going through the transition of things that we have in that example. So I think I think there is a real inclination here that we do need to foster and push and drive adoption of the right technologies and innovations, because we've backed it up with proof of concept through some of the research programs, like things that our RDAR is funding. Because if we don't, we really risk being in a situation where we have a whole different problem that is much more larger and more difficult to solve, and we cannot afford to rest on our laurels just because, hey, we're Canada and everyone loves us and everyone's going to love to buy our products. That is not the reality of where the export market is here currently.
But Shaun and Mark, to start to bring this to a close, I think one of the things that I've heard over and over again as we've done work on ag innovation is that if we're not in a crisis in the ag innovation system, we're awful close to one. And I wonder, just as we think about this kind of idea, Mark, that's a simple change really that you talk about. How do we better connect the farmers and the researchers at the end of the day? Is this one of these kind of small steps that can make a big difference and hopefully steer us out of the ag innovation crisis that may be coming? Mark, what do you think?
Sorry, you just gave me a Neil Armstrong moment there, Tyler, in terms of small step and a giant leap. Absolutely, I think it is, and that's why I appreciate opportunities like this to talk about those small steps, because if we can get others to do the same, and a lot of the national conversations that we're having now, I think can set that forwards. People do want to learn, though, in terms of what have the challenges been, and the academics are finding funding harder to find. They see these extra requirements which are being placed upon them as being overly burdensome. I've walked a mile in their shoes. I get where they're coming from, and this isn't a big ask. So, if you want to say trust us and go with us, that small step can get us that giant leap, because it won't only be in a lot of the basic areas. This can be in terms of adopting robotics and adopting artificial intelligence. And I will say that RDAR is reaching out now to other departments than agriculture in the post-secondaries. We are working with engineering groups. We are working with others. And again, that transdisciplinary piece is really going to be key. So lots of small steps in multiple areas is what's going to drive us.
I think though here a lot of times we're talking about farmer researcher connection in the early stages, but I think we also need to make sure that we have it post as well. And there's where extension becomes, I think, a real concern, as we have seen a major pullback in what our extension networks look like. We do not have the land grant university system like the US does, and so therefore our model was a little bit different, and our model has sort of slowly been deteriorating depending on which province you are in, and pushing it all off to the universities. I'm not sure that's sustainable, because they've got their own financial challenges in 2026 that are a little bit, they're not, hey, where do I spend all this money? They just don't have all these buckets of it. So I think the extension, because we won't have the adoption if we don't have the extension. Just creating it and they will all come is built, that's built completely on false pretenses. So communicating the value and trying to drive that adoption, extension is a critical component of that.
And I think, people always have a lot of nostalgia for the DA. And, it had its day, but today we've got different tools. I mean, we do have the internet in our pockets, and the work that RDAR has done with FCC on route, where you can actually take a picture of a weed and it'll tell you what it is. It'll connect you with a researcher who's working on these pieces. So that's doing part of the role. Having boots on the ground is important, and I think this is where the opportunity to work with, as I say, Alberta has our Applied Research and Forage Associations to help their staff members upskill so that they know how to collect data better. I see the opportunity to actually build, should we say, a neural network, which our tools today can support, which 100 years ago or 50 years ago in Alberta, they couldn't. So, let's think about the future and using the future resources as opposed to being nostalgic. Completely with you, Shaun, though, in terms of it does come down to our third practice. Who can help me with this?
Yeah.
And, that could be, ideally somebody you can go and talk to and share a six-pack with, if you're a motivator. More likely it's going to happen in the coffee shop. But let's power that up. But how can somebody connect with a community of practice? And so building these communities, again, it's getting outside of the silo and really making those things happen.
Yeah, one of the big barriers to adoption is complexity. Upfront cost and return on investment are definitely there. Complexity is the third point of that triangle. And if you have to have resources to help people steer through those, the early days of that adoption, or, even more to an advanced level. And you look at the farm equipment dealership networks, they figured this out, just implementing precision ag or, variable rate and saying, hey, go at it. Here you go. We wrote the script, all yours. That's a failed model. Right now, they have like precision ag technicians right inside the dealership, no different than they have a mechanic. And that's another example of today's world of, knowledge transfer and extension.
I'll tell you what I've seen in medicine, though, with VR headsets and things. You put the VR headset on and you're working on something and you're talking to the guy in Nebraska who is seeing what you're seeing. He sees what you're touching or saying, don't touch that. We've got tools today which can put you on the spot. And for Pete's sake, they're using them on Artemis. So, let's bring agriculture into that next generation of thinking. What are the barriers? That's a question.
But to that technology point, Mark, that's where rural high-speed internet infrastructure is a critical bolt-on to this. That VR headset to talk to that person in Nebraska is great, and we should be pushing forward on that. But we have to make sure that if I'm in Maple Creek or Peace River or wherever on Ontario or Atlantic Canada, I have the ability to use that technology even with my remoteness.
Right,
that is critical.
But Shaun
and
and Mark,
close.
So Mark, again, I want to step in because I think what you're doing is often what we end up doing too often in Canadian agriculture, where we've gone down kind of we're letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And some of these things are longer term issues. I'm going to go back to Mark where you started us, right? What we need to do is more of those connections between researchers and scientists. And we might not be able to fix rural broadband in the near future, although I think we're doing some on that. We should be able to fix this problem. And I think, Mark, that's a good kind of message to end on as we think about kind of the next policy framework, changes on those programs, and how do we fix the problems that we've got with ag innovation and ag science in this country.
And,
so maybe
the important opportunity we have right now is either through Minister McDonald's roundtables, or I know we're meeting with Minister Sigurdsson next week to talk about this, to actually put some of these cases forwards and not to use those opportunities just to air grievances. Let's be proactive and future looking here.
We like the future. Good note to end on. Thank you very much to Mark and Shaun for joining us today.
Well,
appreciate the opportunity.
The invitation. Yeah.
Well, Elise, Mark and Shaun are pretty passionate about ag innovation and bridging that gap. What did you think of that conversation?
I thought it really harkened back to some of the other conversations we've had of the big ideas are very simple, but they're often really difficult to get to. And in this one, very little of it is about the actual research. And it's really, we need to talk, and we need to talk from the beginning. And that's where I see that critical kind of breakdown, so that you can't even think about the rest of the system if the producer isn't involved in the beginning.
And I think that RDAR's got a model that works. I think we see variations of it, but it's been disheartening a bit to see the fact that actually we see the government pulling back on that. And this is a good reminder that actually what we should be doubling down is closing that divide between that gap between producers and researchers. But just as Mark and Shaun did at the end, I think too often we get caught up on yeah, but what about all of these other things? And as you say, miss out on some of the basic, simple stuff we need to get right.
Yeah. And I really liked RDAR's model and what we're talking about from the hands of producers and into the hands of producers. And I think if you have the right people at the table at those times, some of those issues that you're talking about will dissipate or will be easier to overcome.
And now's the time to really double down on that. And I just want to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. If you have any big ideas, we want to hear from you. So please contact us if you have a big idea for change in Canadian agriculture.
Perfect. And thanks again to Mark and Shaun for joining. And thank you for tuning in to Cappy's Ag Policy Connection, a podcast where we talk about the big ideas and fresh thinking needed to solve the big challenges and seize the big opportunities facing Canadian agriculture and food. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Elise. See you next time.